Signed the papers without looking up. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the affair, not the whispered plan to push her out of everything they had built together. It was the way Roman Vescari slid those separation documents across his mahogany desk, like he was closing a minor business transaction, like 30 years of her life, amounted to something he could file away in a drawer and forget existed. Claire Whitmore had walked into that office, expecting to surprise her husband with dinner reservations. She walked out carrying photographs of documents that would dismantle his entire world. If you have ever given someone everything, your loyalty, your name, your family's fortune, and watched them hand it to someone else without a single moment of hesitation, then you already know exactly how Claire felt standing in that elevator. Her phone pressed against her chest, her hands completely still. Question is, what would you have done next? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you stories like this. One story is about betrayal, power, and the kind of strength that only appears after someone tries to break you completely. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and tell me what city or country you're watching them from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, and stay with us until the very end, because what Claire Whitmore did next is something none of us saw coming, including Roman Vescari. The elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor, and Claire stepped out the way she always did, quietly, deliberately, without announcing herself. It was a habit she had developed over years of moving through spaces that technically belonged to her but never quite felt like it. The headquarters of Vescari Holdings occupied the entire top floor of one of the most recognizable buildings on Michigan Avenue, and even now, after more than a decade of walking those same marble floors, Claire never felt completely at home there. She had brought dinner. That detail matters, because it says something about who Claire was, at that point in their marriage, not naive, exactly, but still trying. Still showing up with a bag from the Italian place on Rush Street that Roman had loved since before he could afford to eat there regularly. Still believing that small gestures added up to something. She told the receptionist not to bother announcing her. Everyone on that floor knew Claire. The security team nodded when she passed. The assistant behind the front desk smiled and looked back down at her computer. Nobody thought twice about Roman Vescari's wife walking through the main corridor toward the private wing, where her husband spent most of his working hours. The door to his office was not fully closed. That was the first thing she noticed. Roman was meticulous about closed doors. He had once spent 10 minutes explaining to a junior associate why a partially open door communicated weakness in a professional environment. Claire had stood beside him during that conversation, watching the young man's face, thinking how strange it was to care that much about a door. She slowed down. Through the narrow gap, she could see Roman standing at his desk, which was unusual, because Roman almost never stood during meetings. He preferred the psychology of being seated when others were not. He had read too many books about dominance and positioning in his 40s, and Claire had watched those books quietly reshape him into someone she didn't always recognize. Selena Cross was standing on the other side of the desk. Claire had known about Selena the way you know about weather, not always looking directly at it, but always aware of what it might do. Selena had come into Roman's organization 4 years ago as a financial strategy advisor, and within 18 months, she had positioned herself as the most indispensable person in the room whenever Roman needed to make a significant decision. She was composed, brilliant in a particular transactional way, and she understood exactly which version of Roman Vescari she needed to speak to at any given moment. Claire had never confronted him about Selena. She told herself it was because she had no proof. The more honest answer was that she was afraid of what confirmation would require her to do, someone he and. She stopped moving entirely. Roman said something Claire couldn't hear clearly, and Selena laughed, not the polished, professional laugh she deployed in meetings, but something smaller and more private. Then Roman reached across the desk and touched Selena's hand, and Claire felt something in her chest go very still and very cold at the same time, the way a lake feels just before it freezes solid. She should have walked away. She knew that. Any reasonable person watching from outside would have told her to leave, to call her attorney, to handle this through the proper channels later. But Claire Whitmore had spent 30 years making reasonable decisions that benefited other people, and something in her refused to move. She listened. What she heard in the next 4 minutes rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. Roman was not talking about the affair. He was talking about the Mercer acquisition, a 9-figure deal he had been assembling quietly for almost 2 years, something Claire knew existed in general terms, but had never been given specifics about. She had assumed she wasn't given specifics, because Roman had decided somewhere along the way to stop including her in significant business decisions. She was right about that. She just hadn't understood the reason yet. Selena was telling him that the timeline needed to accelerate, that waiting another quarter created unnecessary exposure. That the board would ask questions they weren't prepared to answer if certain asset transfers became visible before the acquisition closed. Roman said that the board question was manageable. Selena said the real problem wasn't the board. There was a pause. The kind of pause that comes before someone says something they've been waiting to say for a long time. Claire needs to be removed from the ownership structure before this closes, Selena said. Her family trust still has controlling interest in 4 of the 6 entities we're using as acquisition vehicles. If she ever decides to actually look at what we're doing, she won't, Roman said. He said it the way you say something you've repeated to yourself enough times that it stopped being a question. She doesn't look she trusts. She trusted, Selena corrected. That's a past tense situation, Roman. The woman isn't stupid. She's been quiet. There's a difference. I'll handle Claire. How? Roman was quiet for a moment. Then, separation agreement. Generous settlement. She takes the house in Lake Forest, the personal accounts, a monthly arrangement that keeps her comfortable. She signs off on the business interests in exchange for security. She'll take it. It's cleaner than anything else. And if she doesn't, she will. He said it with such complete certainty that it stopped sounding like confidence and started sounding like something else. Like contempt. She always does what makes sense. It's her most reliable quality. Claire stood in that hallway for 3 more seconds. Then she took out her phone and photographed every document visible on Roman's desk through the gap in the door. She got 7 clear images before she heard footsteps moving toward the door from the inside. She turned and walked back toward the elevator at a pace that looked purposeful without looking rushed, the dinner bag still hanging from her left hand, her face completely neutral. She pressed the button. The doors opened immediately. She stepped inside. The elevator doors closed. She looked at herself in the mirrored panel. She looked like the same person she had been 20 minutes ago. Same gray wool coat, same dark hair beginning to show silver at the temples, in a way she had mostly stopped fighting. Same quiet face that Roman had once described, early in their marriage, as the face of someone who understood things without needing to be told. He had meant it as a compliment then. She wasn't sure what he would call it now. She did not cry in the elevator. She thought she might, and then she didn't, and that surprised her more than the conversation had. Instead, she felt something sharpen inside her. Not anger, exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. Something older and more structural than anger. The feeling you get when something you suspected for a long time finally becomes a fact, and the world reorganizes itself around the fact, the way water finds drain. She had trusted Roman Vescari with her family's money and her family's name and 30 years of her own life. He had described that trust as her most reliable quality, meaning he had relied on it, meaning he had built around it, meaning he had, for some period of time she couldn't yet calculate, treated her loyalty as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The lobby doors opened. Claire walked through them into the November cold and stood on the sidewalk for exactly 45 seconds. She knew it was 45 seconds because she counted. It was something her father had taught her: count when you need to think, because counting requires just enough attention to prevent panic from taking over. At 45, she stopped counting. She put the dinner bag down on the edge of a concrete planter outside the building's entrance, turned and walked to her car. She did not go to the Lake Forest house that night. She went instead to the apartment on the near north side that technically belonged to a holding company under her family's trust, the same trust Roman had apparently forgotten to actually examine in any detail. The apartment had been used for various purposes over the years: visiting relatives, lawyers in town for extended negotiations, the occasional overnight stay when one of her brothers was in the city. Claire had her own key. She had always had her own key to more things than Roman realized, because Roman stopped paying attention to the architecture of their shared financial life sometime around the point when he decided the architecture belonged entirely to him. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, a glass of water she never drank, and her phone. She pulled up the photographs. The documents were exactly what she had suspected, and also somehow worse. The asset transfer structure being used for the Mercer acquisition had been deliberately designed to route everything through entities where Claire's family trust had either been marginalized or quietly excluded from recent amendments. Someone, and she was already certain, it was Selina's work, had spent considerable effort constructing a paper architecture that would make it appear, to a casual observer, that Claire's ownership interests were minor and non-controlling. The operative word being appear, because Claire's family attorney had drafted the original trust documents in 1987, and those documents contained language specific enough that rerouting around them would require Claire's own signature. Language that Roman had apparently either forgotten about or assumed Claire had forgotten about. She had not forgotten about anything. At 11:17 that night, she made one phone call. The person who answered was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been her family's financial manager for 22 years, and who had the particular quality of sounding completely unsurprised by phone calls at any hour. Claire had once asked him if anything ever caught him off guard, and Gerald had thought about it seriously for a moment, before saying, "Not anymore. I stopped being surprised by what people do with money when I was about 43. Gerald," Claire said, "I need you to activate everything under my name." Pause. Everything? Everything that was mine before Roman, and everything that's still mine now. I want a complete accounting by 6 in the morning. I want every controlling position identified, and I want to know exactly which of his structures depend on our cooperation to remain functional. Another pause, shorter this time. Claire. His voice was careful in the way that meant he understood the weight of what she was asking. "Are you sure you want to move this fast?" "He's moving it himself," she said. "He just doesn't know I know that yet." Gerald was quiet for a moment. She could hear him adjusting in his chair, which meant he was already reaching for something on his desk. "I'll have it ready. Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm somewhere Roman doesn't have the address for," she said. "That's close enough." She ended the call and set her phone face down on the table. Roman believed his wife was about to lose everything. He built that belief carefully over years by watching her defer and accommodate and absorb his decisions, without visible complaint. He had watched her shrink herself to fit the space he left available, and he had concluded that shrinking was all she was capable of. What he had never bothered to investigate was why she had been so quiet. Claire Whitmore had been quiet because she was watching. She had been watching for a very long time. The next morning arrived with Gerald's spreadsheets and a cup of coffee. Claire made herself in a kitchen that smelled like nobody's specific life, the neutral smell of a space maintained rather than inhabited. She sat with the documents and went through them the way her father had taught her, methodically, starting from the foundation and working upward, never letting the complexity on the surface obscure what was true underneath. What was true underneath was this: Roman Vescari had built an empire, and a substantial portion of the foundation that empire rested on the legitimate businesses, the investment properties, the corporate holding entities that gave his organization its financial credibility, had been originally capitalized through assets that belonged to Claire's family. Roman had not stolen this. Claire wanted to be precise about that, even in her own thinking, because precision mattered. He had used the money with full agreement, at a time when he had ambition and almost no resources, and Claire had believed in him completely. She had signed documents and made introductions and arranged meetings and done it all willingly because she had loved Roman Vescari and believed he was going to become something significant. She had been right about that. She had just been wrong about what that significance would do to him. Somewhere in the years between the early struggling days and the current reality of a man standing in front of a glass and steel building that bore his name, Roman had rewritten the story. He had done it gradually, the way habits form not with a single decision, but with 100 small ones, each one moving the narrative slightly in his direction, each one making Claire slightly less visible in the accounting of how things had come to be. By the time Selena arrived in his life, the rewrite was nearly complete. He had told the story of his own genius and his own determination and his own vision so many times that he had apparently stopped remembering there had been another version. Selena had simply confirmed what Roman already wanted to believe. Claire drank her coffee and read through the spreadsheets and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not devastation, but clarity. Kind of clarity that comes after a very long confusion finally resolves into a single sharp fact. The fact was this: Roman thought he was preparing to offer Claire a settlement. What he had actually done was hand her a detailed blueprint of exactly how dependent his empire was on her continued cooperation. Picked up her phone again, not to call Roman, not yet. She called her attorney first. Then she called her oldest brother, who had been her father's closest business partner before their father died, and who had watched Roman Vescari's ascent with an expression Claire had chosen for years not to examine too carefully. "I know," her brother said before she got past the third sentence. "What do you mean you know?" "I mean I've been waiting for this call for approximately 8 years, he said. "What do you need?" Claire looked down at the spreadsheet on the table in front of her. She looked at the column of numbers that represented everything her family had put into Roman's world on the faith that Roman would always treat it as theirs. "I need you to come to Chicago," she said, "and I need you to bring everything Dad left us." Her brother was on a flight by noon. Roman called her at 2 in the afternoon. She let it ring through to voicemail. He called again at 2:17. She listened to the message later. His voice was measured, careful, with the particular tone of someone who has decided exactly what they want to communicate and is delivering it as though reading from a script they've practiced. He said he understood there were some things they needed to discuss. He said he thought it was important for them to speak honestly about the future of their arrangement. He said he had always respected Claire and wanted to make sure she was taken care of. Claire listened to the message in its entirety. Then she deleted it. She was not going to be taken care of. She was going to be the person making the decisions about who got taken care of and who did not. And Roman was going to understand that the moment he looked across a boardroom table and found her sitting at the head of it. That was still 3 days away. For now, she had work to do. She opened her laptop, spread Gerald's documents across the kitchen table beside her brother's files, and began building the clearest, most complete picture she could of exactly what Roman Vescari believed he owned. And what he was about to discover he did not. Outside the apartment window, Chicago moved through its November business gray sky, sharp wind off the lake, the sound of the city doing what it always does, which is continue, regardless of what is breaking apart, inside any given building, on any given street. Claire sat at her kitchen table and worked without stopping for 4 hours. And if you had seen her from across the room, you would have seen someone who looked, from the outside, perfectly calm. You would have had no idea that she was dismantling 30 years of someone else's certainty, one document at a time. Roman Vescari had made a career out of reading rooms correctly. He had completely misread this one. Roman called a third time at 4:47 in the afternoon. Claire was on the phone with her attorney when his name lit up the screen and she watched it blink 3 times before it stopped. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had handled Claire's family trust since before Roman was anyone significant, kept talking without pausing, walking Claire through the procedural timeline, the filing sequence, the specific order in which each piece needed to move to prevent Roman from seeing the full shape of what was coming before. It was already too late for him to respond. Patricia had that quality that the best attorneys develop over long careers, She spoke about catastrophic things in the same voice she used to discuss lunch. Claire had always found it steadying rather than cold. The 4 entities with the amended operating agreements, Patricia said. We need to look at those first. If his team filed those amendments without your signature, we have a problem they created for themselves. If somehow they get your signature on something you didn't read carefully enough, we have a different kind of problem. I read everything I signed, Claire said. I know you do. I'm covering the possibility that something was buried inside a larger document. It happens. Claire pulled one of Gerald's folders toward her across the kitchen table. Her brother Martin was sitting across from her, not talking, which was his particular version of support. He had always understood that Claire needed presence more than commentary when she was working through something difficult. He was drinking coffee from a mug that said Chicago on the side in block letters. A mug she didn't recognize that had apparently been in the apartment's cabinet for long enough that nobody remembered where it came from. Walk me through the Mercer structure, Claire said. Patricia was quiet for exactly the length of time it takes to open a file on a desk. 6 acquisition vehicles. The primary one, Meridian Bridge Holdings, is where the actual transaction closes. The other 5 are feeder entities. 3 of them show your family trust as a passive minority investor in filings from 2 years ago. Passive minority, Claire repeated. That's how they're characterized now. The original capitalization documents from 2009 tell a different story, but your family trust contributed controlling interest capital to 2 of those entities when they were first formed. Someone at some point amended the operating agreements to reclassify that contribution as non-voting preferred. Claire put her pen down. Without my signature. Without anything bearing your signature that I can find so far. We're still looking. Martin looked up from his coffee. Claire said, how much exposure does that create for them? Significant, Patricia said. If those amendments were executed without proper authority, the reclassification is void. Which means your family trust's controlling position in those 2 entities was never legally altered. Which means every transaction those entities participated in over the last 2 years required your approval. And didn't get it. And didn't get it. Claire was quiet for a moment. Patricia, she said, how bad is this for Roman specifically? Patricia's answer came after a pause that was slightly longer than her usual rhythm, which was itself a kind of answer. The Mercer acquisition closes before this gets untangled, and then it comes out that 2 of the core acquisition vehicles had unauthorized ownership amendments. The liability exposure to the controlling parties is substantial. We're talking about unwinding a 9-figure deal, potential fraud claims, regulatory review of the whole structure. And Selena Cross's fingerprints are on the amendments. Her credentials authorize the filing. Whether she acted alone or under instruction is a different question. Claire picked her pen back up. She wrote 3 words on the legal pad in front of her and underlined them twice. He gave access. It wasn't about whether Selena had acted independently. The access had come from Roman. The trust had come from Roman. Whatever Selena had done inside the organization, she had done it inside a structure that Roman controlled, with credentials that Roman had authorized. The chain of responsibility didn't stop at Selena Cross. Roman had spent years constructing an image of himself as the man who saw everything, controlled everything, and bore ultimate authority over every decision made within his sphere. He couldn't have it both ways. He couldn't claim absolute power and then point to a subordinate when things went wrong. Claire understood that she needed to make that point in the right room, at the right moment, in front of the right people. She wasn't ready to do that yet, but she was getting there. Roman came to the house in Lake Forest on the 2nd day. Claire was not there when he arrived, but she knew he had been because the housekeeper, a woman named Dora, who had worked for Claire's family since before the marriage, and whose loyalty ran in the direction of whoever signed her original employment agreement, texted her a single sentence, "He was here for 40 minutes and didn't look happy when he left." Claire texted back, "Thank you, Dora." She was sitting in Patricia's office downtown when the text arrived, reviewing documents spread across a conference table that was longer than some rooms Claire had grown up in. Gerald was there. Martin was there. A forensic accountant named Howard that Gerald had brought in was there, working through the amended operating agreements with the particular intensity of someone who has found a thread worth pulling and cannot stop pulling it. Howard looked up from his stack of papers and said, without preamble, whoever struck this knew exactly what they were doing. Selena Cross, Gerald said. Smart, Howard said, which was not the same as a compliment. The amendments are nested inside routine annual filings. If you weren't looking for the ownership reclassification specifically, you'd miss it. They went 3 layers deep in 2 of the entities before the language changes. Can we unwind it? Martin asked. We don't need to unwind it, Claire said. Everyone at the table looked at her. We just need to demonstrate that it's void. We're not arguing about what the structure looks like now. We're arguing about what authority existed to change it. And that authority never existed. Howard studied her for a moment. That's correct. But it means going in front of the board. I know. Roman will fight it. I know that too. He's going to be. Howard stopped himself. Started differently. He's not going to sit still for this. No, Claire agreed. He's not. She looked down at the document. In front of her, the original 2009 Trust Capitalization Agreement. 18 pages, with her family attorney's neat typewritten language on every page, the signatures at the end, in her father's handwriting, and her own. Her father had been alive then. He had sat across a table not entirely different from this one and said, in the careful way he said things that mattered, Claire, you're sure about this man? And she had said yes, she had been sure. She had been 29 years old, and completely certain, which is its own kind of temporary condition. Schedule the board meeting, she said. 3 days. Patricia looked up. That's fast. Roman's moving fast, Claire said. The Mercer acquisition timeline has been accelerated. Selena told him to close before the ownership questions become visible, which means every day we wait is a day closer to a closing that we cannot undo after the fact. Patricia nodded slowly. I'll make the calls. Roman found out about the board meeting from a man named Davis, who sat on the legitimate business board and who had known Roman for 15 years, and whose definition of loyalty apparently included a phone call warning system. Roman called Claire 20 minutes after Davis called him. This time she answered. What are you doing? Roman said. It wasn't a question. His voice had the specific controlled flatness of someone managing their volume carefully because they understand that shouting would be an admission of something. Hello, Roman? Don't do that. Don't do the calm voice. I'm not doing anything with my voice. I'm answering the phone. You called a board meeting. I did. On what authority? Claire let the question sit in the air for a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long time inside a silence. On the authority established by the original trust capitalization documents from 2009, which I believe you have copies of. A pause. Then Claire. Yes, I think we should talk before this gets any further. We are talking in person. His voice changed slightly, not softer, exactly, but adjusted. She had heard that adjustment before. It was the sound of Roman deciding that the direct approach wasn't working, and shifting to something he believed was more effective. She had watched him deploy it in negotiations, in arguments with vendors, in conversations with men who thought they were his equals and discovered they were not. She had always found it interesting to watch from the outside. Being the target of it was a different experience. I can be in Lake Forest in an hour. We sit down without attorneys, and we talk like 2 adults who've known each other for 30 years. I'm not in Lake Forest. A pause. Where are you? That's not relevant to this conversation. She heard him breathe. Not loudly. Roman never did anything loudly, but she heard it, and she knew what that particular breath meant. It meant he was recalibrating. It meant the situation had dimensions he hadn't mapped yet, and Roman Vescari was not comfortable operating in unmapped territory. Claire Queter. Now, whatever you think happened. I don't think anything happened, Roman. I know what happened. I was there. Silence. I was in the corridor, she said. Outside your office. Thursday evening. I brought dinner from Gabrielle's, which was probably unnecessary in retrospect. The silence on his end of the phone had a different quality now. She had heard Roman Vescari handle surprises before he was good at it, better than most people. But this was not a surprise he had prepared for because it was a surprise he hadn't believed was possible. He had believed she didn't look. He had believed she trusted. He had made an empire-level bet on her contentious and curiosity, and she was calling in that bet. "I heard the conversation," she said. "I photographed the documents on your desk. And I've spent the last 48 hours with a forensic accountant who has been very thorough. Claire, the board meeting happens in 3 days, Roman. If you want to talk before that, have your attorney call Patricia." She ended the call. Her hand, she noticed, was completely steady. Roman showed up at Patricia's office the next morning, without an appointment. He walked past the receptionist while she was still reaching for the phone and pushed open the conference room door and stopped when he saw Claire sitting at the table with Gerald and Howard and Martin, all of them with coffee cups and documents, and the particular focused stillness of people who have been working for hours. Roman looked at Martin first. The two men had never had a warm relationship. Martin had always watched Roman with that careful, waiting expression. And Roman had always found it unsettling in a way he never directly addressed. And the look that passed between them, now, was the compressed version of a long disagreement finally arriving at its conclusion. Then Roman looked at Claire. She looked back. He was dressed the way he always dressed for serious situations, charcoal suit, no tie, the kind of presentation that communicated authority without formality. His hair was perfect. His posture was perfect. Everything about Roman Vescari's exterior was always composed to project a specific effect, and Claire had spent enough years studying that projection to know exactly how much effort went into it. Today, the effort was more visible than usual. "Can we have the room?" Roman said. Question. Nobody moved. Roman looked at Claire again. "It's their room," Claire said. "They can leave if they want to." Nobody left. Roman pulled out the chair at the far end of the table from Claire and sat down without being invited, which was the only way Roman Vescari sat anywhere, as though the act of sitting established ownership of the space. He put both hands flat on the table. "I want to talk about what this is actually going to accomplish." "What do you think it's going to accomplish?" Claire asked. "Damage. To both of us. To everything we built. You didn't build it alone." His jaw tightened. "Just slightly. I know that." "Do you?" Martin said. Roman looked at him. "I'm talking to my wife, ex-wife," Martin said. "Or near enough." "Martin." Claire said it without heat. Her brother looked at her and then back at his coffee and went quiet. Roman refocused on Claire. "I made mistakes," he said. The words came out with the quality of something rehearsed, not false, exactly, but prepared. "I understand that. The way things developed with Selena, that's something I should have handled differently." "I know that. I'm not here about Selena," Claire said. That caught him. She saw it a micro-adjustment, his expression, the faintest recalibration. He had come in expecting to manage an emotionally injured wife, and instead found a woman who had apparently moved past the injury and arrived at something considerably more procedural. "The ownership amendments," Claire said. "The Mercer acquisition structure. The asset transfers that moved through entities, where my family trust holds controlling interest without any authorization from me or my representatives. That's what this is about, Roman. The marriage is its own separate discussion. It's about the business." Roman was quiet for a moment. "Those amendments were a structural decision, executed without the authority required by the original trust documents. Our legal team reviewed." "Your legal team," Howard said from his end of the table, speaking for the first time since Roman had entered the room. He had the unimpressed delivery of someone who had reviewed enough fraudulent documentation to have lost patience with euphemism. "Not the trust's legal team, not the board's legal team. Attorneys working directly under your authority, reviewing amendments that benefited your position at the direct expense of the trust's controlling rights. That's not a legal review. That's a cover." Roman looked at Howard with the expression of a man deciding how seriously to take an obstacle. "And you are forensic accounting," Howard said pleasantly. "I've been doing this for 31 years. I've seen tidier work." Roman looked back at Claire. Something in his face had shifted not into softness, but into something that was attempting to approximate it. Claire, I understand why you're angry. What I said in that office, the way I talked about you. He stopped. Started differently. That wasn't who I want to be. I've been under pressure with this acquisition, and I said things I wouldn't say if I'd had more time to. Roman. Her voice was very quiet. I don't need you to apologize for what you said about me. I need you to understand what you did with my family's money. Our money. No, she said it simply without edge. My family capitalized those entities before you were who you are. You benefited from that, with full agreement and full trust. What you did not have was the right to alter the ownership structure without consent. You know that. Your attorneys know that, which is why the amendments are buried 3 layers deep in Seed's routine filings. Roman sat back in his chair. The movement was small, but the meaning was large. It was the movement of a man who has walked into a room expecting to control it and understood, somewhere around the 3rd minute, that he was not going to. What do you want? He said. I want the board meeting to happen, Claire said. I want an independent review of every transaction involving those 6 entities over the past 2 years. I want the Mercer acquisition suspended, pending that review. Suspending the acquisition kills the deal. The deal was structured on a fraudulent ownership foundation. Roman. The deal should be killed. He stared at her. Do you understand what that costs? Do you understand what the alternative costs? Another silence. Longer this time. If this goes to the board, Roman said, it goes public. Investors, regulators, everyone starts asking questions. Everything we built gets pulled apart. Then you should have thought about that, Martin said quietly. Before you let someone file fraudulent amendments on a trust document, our father spent 2 years negotiating. Roman looked at Martin. Something passed through his expression that was not quite guilt and not quite anger, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. Martin, I understand your position. My position, Martin said, is that I watched my father give you everything he had to give, on the faith that you were going to treat his daughter and his legacy with the basic respect he asked for. And you used that faith as a structural component in a financial fraud. He picked up his coffee cup. That's my position. The room was very quiet. Roman looked down at the table. He looked at his own hands, the way people sometimes look at their hands when they've run out of responses, not studying them, just needing somewhere to rest their eyes while they absorb something. Then he looked up at Claire. The meeting happens no matter what I say right now, doesn't it? Yes. And the review? Yes, and you've already contacted the other board members. Patricia has. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man doing arithmetic, calculating what he still had, what he could protect, where the remaining leverage lived. She knew that nod. She had watched it precede 100 decisions over the course of 30 years, and she understood that it meant he had not surrendered. It meant he was restructuring. I'll have my attorneys reach out to Patricia, he said. He stood up, straightened his jacket. The composure was back, not fully, but enough to wear in public. This doesn't have to be permanent, Claire. She didn't answer. He walked toward the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. And for a moment, just a single moment, something showed through the composure that was not calculated. Something that looked like the man she had married in a courthouse on a Tuesday in March 30 years ago. The man who had held her hand too tight during the ceremony because he was nervous and wouldn't admit it. I did believe in us, he said. Whatever you think, I did believe in it. I know you did, she said for a while. He left. The room stayed quiet for a full 30 seconds after the door closed. Then Gerald said he's going to try to close the Mercer deal before the board meeting. I know, Claire said, if he moves fast enough. He won't be fast enough. She pulled a document from the folder in front of her. Patricia is filing a temporary restraining order on the acquisition this afternoon. The moment it's served, the deal is frozen until the board convenes. Howard looked at the document and then at Claire with the expression of someone who has just revised their assessment of a situation significantly upward. You had that ready. I had that ready yesterday, Claire said. I was waiting to see if he'd come in here and tell the truth voluntarily. Martin looked at his sister. He had the expression of someone seeing a person he thought he knew from a slightly different angle. And if he had? Claire was quiet for a moment. She looked at the conference room door, that Roman had closed behind him with such careful control. Then we would have had a different conversation, she said. But he didn't. She slid the TRO filing across the table to Patricia. File it, she said. The restraining order was served to Meridian Bridge Holdings registered agent at 3:41 that afternoon. Roman found out at 3:44. Claire's phone rang at 3:51. She didn't answer. She was sitting in the back of a car, heading toward the near North Side apartment, watching Chicago slide past the window in the particular blue-gray light of a November late afternoon. And she was thinking about her father. He had been a man of very few dramatic statements. He had expressed most of what he felt through action, through showing up, through the specific documents he chose to keep, and which ones he let go, through the people he trusted with the things that mattered, and the careful way he withdrew that trust when it was misused. She had watched him do it twice in her life, once with a business partner and once with a relative, and both times the withdrawal had been so clean and so complete that the other person never fully understood what had happened until it was already finished. She had thought at the time that it seemed cold. She understood it differently now. Her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. Not Roman this time. Selena Cross. She stared at the name for a long moment. Selena had never called her directly. Not once. In 4 years of operating inside the same organizational sphere, had Selena Cross made a direct personal call to Claire Vescari. 2 women had been in the same rooms dozens of times, board presentations, charity events, the kind of professional social occasions that Roman required his inner circle to attend. And Cesena had always maintained the specific kind of careful professional courtesy, that is, itself, a form of distance. Claire answered. Claire. Selena's voice was not what Claire had expected. She had expected the composed, strategic voice from the office, the voice that had told Roman she needed to be removed from the ownership structure. What she heard instead was something with an edge to it. Not panic. More like controlled urgency. The voice of someone who has run the numbers and understands that the numbers are moving against them. I think we should talk. I'm listening, Claire said. Not on the phone. A pause. Know what's happening with the board meeting. I know about the TRO. I know you found the amendments. Then you know that your credentials authorized those amendments. I know what the filings show, Selena said carefully. Is there a different version of events you'd like to offer? Silence on the line. Then, Roman told me the amendments had board approval. He told me it was a routine restructuring that had already been authorized. I executed the filings based on what he represented to me. Claire said nothing. I understand, Selena continued, that that's not the whole story. I've spent the last 18 hours going through everything, and I understand now that the authorization Roman described didn't exist. And I understand what that means for my position. It means your credentials are attached to unauthorized alterations of a trust document, Claire said. That's not a small thing, no. A breath, it's not. Another pause. Claire, I want to be clear about something. Whatever Roman told you, whatever you think I am to him. She stopped. Started again. I'm not what he made it sound like. I thought I understood what I was getting into. I didn't. Claire looked out the car window. They were passing the river, the last daylight catching the water, in a way that made it look briefly like something other than what it was. What did you think you were getting into? A professional situation that had some personal complications, Selena said. What it actually was someone using me as a tool. For the business and for other things. She said the last 3 words with a flatness that communicated a great deal without stating any of it. You're going to cooperate with the independent review, Claire said. It was not a question, yes, fully. Yes, but I need. She paused. I need to know that my cooperation is going to matter. That being honest about what Roman told me, and what he directed me to do, and what the real authorization structure was. I need to know that counts for something. Talk to Patricia Hale, Claire said. She's my attorney. She'll discuss the review process. And Roman? What about Roman? Is he going to come after me for this? Claire thought about that for a moment. She thought about Roman's face in the conference room, the arithmetic behind his eyes, the restructuring she had watched happen. In real time. He's going to try to protect himself, she said, whether that means Coming after you depends on what serves him best. I'd move fast if I were you. Selena was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said. I know. It doesn't do anything useful. But I am. Claire did not say it was fine because it wasn't. She did not say she understood because she was still deciding exactly what she understood about Selena Cross. What she said was, call Patricia tonight. She ended the call. Car pulled up in front of the apartment building. Claire sat for a moment without moving, her hand on the door handle, looking at the building's plain facade. She thought about Roman standing in Patricia's conference room, saying, I did believe in us. She thought about Selena's voice with that controlled urgency in it, the sound of someone who had bet on the wrong side of a situation and was recalculating fast. She thought about her father's face the first time she had brought Roman home for dinner, the careful way he had watched Roman talk, the questions he had asked, that seemed like polite interest but were actually assessment. She had thought her father was being protective. She understood now that he had been being thorough. She opened the car door and went inside. Upstairs, she spread every document across the kitchen table again, opened her laptop, and began drafting the agenda for the board meeting. 3 days away. Everything she had built toward for the past 72 hours was converging on a single table. A single moment when the full weight of what Roman had done would have to be acknowledged by the people who had sat in his boardroom and accepted his authority without asking enough questions. She worked until 2 in the morning. At 2:17, she received a text from a number she didn't recognize. The message contained 4 words and a document attachment. The 4 words were, you need to see this. She opened the attachment. It took her 40 seconds to understand what she was looking at. When she understood, she sat back in her chair and felt something cold move through her that was not quite shock, because she had suspected something like this might exist somewhere, but was still shock because suspecting and seeing are not the same thing at all. The document was a wire transfer record, dated 14 months ago. The receiving account belonged to a company called Northgate Advisory Partners. Northgate Advisory Partners, according to a secondary document attached below the wire record, was a holding company registered in Delaware with a single beneficial owner, Roman's mother. Claire stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Patricia Hale at 2 in the morning, without hesitating for a single second, because what she was looking at changed the shape of everything she thought she had understood about who had done what to whom and why, and she was not going to wait until morning to begin understanding the new shape. Patricia, she said when the phone was answered, I need you to find everything you can on a Delaware company called Northgate Advisory Partners. Tonight. She heard Patricia already moving, already reaching. And Patricia, whatever you find, I need it confirmed before the board meeting. Because if this is what I think it is, Roman Vescari isn't the only person in this story who owes an accounting. The board meeting was in 3 days. 3 days was not very much time. But Claire Whitmore had spent 30 years waiting, without knowing she was waiting. 3 days, it turned out, was more than enough. Patricia called back at 3:41 in the morning. Claire had not slept. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with the wire transfer document open on her laptop and a legal pad full of handwritten notes that had started neat and become progressively less neat as the hours passed. The handwriting getting tighter and more compressed, the way her thinking always did when she was working through something that kept revealing new layers every time she believed she had reached the bottom of it. She answered on the first ring. Northgate Advisory Partners. Patricia said, without greeting, because at 3:41 in the morning between 2 people who had been working the same problem for 72 hours, greetings were a formality neither of them had energy for. Registered in Delaware 14 months ago, single-member LLC. The registered agent is a firm in Wilmington that handles about 400 similar structures, standard anonymity setup. Nothing unusual about the formation documents themselves. The beneficial owner, Claire said. Margaret Vescari. A pause. Roman's mother. Claire had known it was coming. She had read the secondary document 3 times before calling Patricia, and each time the name at the bottom of the ownership disclosure had been the same. but hearing it spoken out loud by another person's voice at 3 in the morning in a quiet apartment kitchen made it real in a way that reading it had not quite accomplished. "How much went through?" Claire asked. "The wire transfer you found is the largest single movement, 4.3 million. But Howard's been running parallel searches for the last hour and a half, and Northgate isn't the only entity. There are two others. A consulting firm registered in Nevada called Crestview Strategic Group that one's been receiving payments for 26 months, which predates Northgate by almost a year. And a third structure in Wyoming that Howard is still untangling." Claire wrote 26 months on her legal pad and stared at it. 26 months ago, Roman had been in the middle of the early negotiations for the Mercer acquisition. 26 months ago, he had come home one evening and told Claire that the next 2 years were going to require his complete focus, that she should plan to manage her own schedule, because his would be essentially unpredictable, and that he was relying on her to handle the household and personal matters without pulling him in unless something was genuinely urgent. She had said she understood. She had thought it was about the deal. She had not known she was being managed, positioned to look away at exactly the right moment. "Patricia," she said, "what is Margaret Vescari's relationship to the acquisition structure?" Tricia's voice was careful in the way it got when she was delivering information she had not yet fully processed herself. Crestview Strategic Group appears in 3 of the 6 acquisition vehicles as a paid consultant. The consulting agreements are buried in the general administrative expense categories, not flagged, not itemized separately, just folded into operational costs. Howard says the total payments over 26 months are just under $11 million. Claire set her pen down. $11 million. Paid to a consulting firm owned by Roman's mother, for consulting services that almost certainly did not exist in any real sense, folded into the operational costs of the same acquisition entities that had been restructured to marginalize Claire's family trust. She thought about Margaret Vescari, a woman she had known for 30 years who had sat at holiday tables and birthday dinners, and the occasional Sunday afternoon, who had always retreated Claire with a specific kind of courteous distance, not hostile, never hostile, just permanently slightly removed, as though Claire were a guest in a house that belonged to someone else. Claire had attributed it to the particular possessiveness some mothers felt about their sons. She had accommodated it the way she accommodated most things in that family, with patience and without comment. She had misread the distance entirely. Margaret Vescari had not been possessive. She had been strategic. She had spent 30 years watching and waiting and feeding a specific narrative into her son's ear, the narrative that Claire was holding him back, that Claire's family money came with invisible chains, that the empire he was building deserved to be entirely his own, and the entire time she had been doing it, she had also been positioning herself to benefit financially from the moment Roman acted on that narrative. The mother had not just shaped her son's resentment. She had monetized it. Claire picked her pen back up. Her hand was not shaking, which surprised her, because what she felt in her chest was something enormous and shapeless that she couldn't fully name yet. It was not anger, though anger was in there. It was not grief, though that was in there too. It was something more like the sensation of standing in a room and watching the walls reveal themselves to be something different from what she'd believed they were discovering, that the architecture of 30 years had a hidden structure she had never been shown. "I need Howard to have everything documented before the board meeting," she said. "Every payment, every entity, every connection to Margaret. Dates, amounts, authorization chains. He'll have it," Patricia said. "Claire, how are you doing?" The question arrived like an unexpected change in temperature. Claire had not been asked that question by anyone in the past 3 days who wasn't her brother, and even Martin had asked it in the particular sideways way of someone who is not entirely sure they want the full answer. "I'm working," she said. "That's not what I asked." Claire looked at the window across from her. It was dark outside, the city reduced to reflected light at this hour, the orange glow of street lamps, the occasional movement of a car. "I'll be better after Thursday," she said. "Ask me then." Patricia let that stand. "Get a few hours of sleep if you can." You need to be sharp in that room. I know, she did not sleep. The morning before the board meeting, Roman made his move. Claire found out from Gerald at 7:48, over the phone, Gerald's voice carrying the particular tightness of someone delivering bad news to a person who is already carrying a significant load. He filed a counterpetition this morning, Gerald said. Emergency motion to invalidate the TRO on the grounds that the trust's controlling interest claim is based on documents that Roman's attorneys are arguing were superseded by a marital property agreement from 2014. Claire was already standing up from the kitchen table. What marital property agreement? That's the question. Gerald paused. His attorneys filed a copy with the court. It bears your signature, Claire. On page 7, there's language that, if it's read a certain way, could be interpreted as a voluntary relinquishment of certain trust-held interests in favor of jointly managed marital assets. I never signed a marital property agreement in 2014. I know that, but the document has your signature. The room was very still. Claire had signed a great many documents in 2014. She had signed quarterly trust reviews and annual investment confirmations and the paperwork for the Lake Forest renovation, and at least a dozen other things that had arrived through Roman's office with tabs marking the signature lines and brief. Explanations that she had always accepted at face value because the brief explanations always made sense, and she had trusted the person providing them. Gerald, she said. Get Howard on the phone. 3-way call, right now. Within 6 minutes, she had both men on the line. Howard had already pulled everything he could access about the 2014 document. The filing date was March 2014. The notarization was from a notary whose stamp matched a firm that had done routine work for Roman's personal attorneys during that period. The signature was hers, at least. It looked like hers. She had good handwriting, consistent, the kind that was hard to fake badly, but perhaps not impossible to replicate carefully. I need to see the original, she said. Roman's attorneys have the original, Howard said. The court filing is a certified copy. Who certified it? The same notary firm. So the certification of the copy came from the same source as the notarization of the original. Pause. Yes, that's not an independent certification, Patricia said. She had joined the call at some point in the last 90 seconds without Claire registering exactly when. That's circular documentation. It proves nothing except that someone who could access both the original and the certification process controlled both steps. Can we challenge the signature? Martin asked. He was on the call too. Claire had no memory of him joining, but was not surprised. Martin had the quality of appearing wherever he was needed in a crisis without requiring direction. We can commission a forensic document examination, Patricia said. But the timeline is a problem. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. Court has to decide on the counterpetition by 5 this afternoon, or the TRO lapses automatically. Claire looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:14 in the morning. She had until 5. Pull every document I signed in 2014, she said. Everything that came through Roman's office. Everything that came through ours. Everything in between. Gerald, I need to know what I was signing in March, specifically. I'm already pulling, Gerald said, and I need a forensic document examiner on the phone in the next hour. I'm calling now, Patricia said. Martin. She looked at her brother. He was sitting across the table, already on his own phone, already moving. I need you to think. 2014. March. Do you remember anything significant happening? Martin looked up. He thought for a moment, genuinely thought, not the performance of thinking, but the real version, his eyes going slightly unfocused the way they did when he was pulling from actual memory. March 2014, he said slowly. That was when Dad had his first cardiac episode. The minor one, before the major one in 2016. Claire felt something shift. March 2015. Her father had been in a hospital in Milwaukee for 11 days following a cardiac episode that had frightened everyone significantly, though it turned out to be less serious than the one that would kill him 2 years later. Claire had spent most of that month in Milwaukee, driving back and forth, sitting in waiting rooms, managing her mother and her brothers, and the practical matters that multiplied during a family health crisis. She had been distracted, genuinely, completely distracted in a way she almost never was. Roman had known that. Roman had been there. He had visited the hospital twice, brought food, been attentive and present and supportive in the way he could be when it served him to be, and Claire had been grateful. And she had signed things his office sent over without reading them, as carefully as she otherwise would have, because her father was in a hospital bed, and her attention was not where it usually was. She sat down very slowly, he knew, she said. Martin watched her. He knew I wouldn't read carefully in March 2014 because Dad was in the hospital and I was managing everything else. She said it quietly, almost to herself. He timed it. The room was very quiet. Claire, Patricia said through the phone, her voice pulling Claire back to the immediate problem. I need you to focus on right now. If that document is authentic, if you did sign something that was misrepresented to you, we can still challenge it on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. But we need to find the original context. What were you signing that month? Was there anything that could have been reframed as a property agreement? Claire closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She went back to March 2014 in the way you go back to something painful carefully, in pieces, not all at once. She remembered the hospital. She remembered Roman's office sending documents. She remembered a tab-marked signature required on what she had been told was an updated beneficiary designation for a jointly held investment account. She opened her eyes. There was a beneficiary designation update, she said. For a joint account, Roman's office said it was routine, something the account custodian required, following a regulatory change. I signed it in the hospital parking lot. I remember because I was in a hurry to get back inside. Martin put his phone down on the table very carefully, the way you put something down when you need your hands free to deal with what you're feeling. Can a beneficiary designation be restructured as a property agreement? Howard asked. Depending on the language, Patricia said, and depending on how creatively someone reads it, possibly. The document contained broader property language that was minimized during explanation, but was actually present in the text, and a judge reads it in context of the overall marital asset structure. She stopped. It's not certain, but it's not impossible, which is exactly what Roman's attorneys are arguing, Claire said. Yes. She stood up again. She couldn't sit anymore. She walked to the window and stood looking at the city and felt the full weight of what she was understanding arrive all at once, which was worse than arriving in pieces. Romans had not simply rewritten their history in his head. He had not merely allowed himself to believe a flattering version of events. He had planned. He had seen a window in March 2014, a moment when her attention was elsewhere, when she was vulnerable in the specific way that genuine fear for a parent makes you vulnerable, and he had used that window deliberately. That was a different thing from arrogance. That was premeditated. She turned from the window. Patricia, she said, what happens to the board meeting if the TRO lapses? Roman's team files to proceed with the acquisition immediately. If they can get a judge to release the hold by end of business today, they could potentially rush a closing before the board convenes tomorrow. Can they close that fast? The structure has been sitting ready for months. If the legal obstacle disappears, the paperwork can be executed within hours. Claire looked at Martin. Martin looked back at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression their father had worn the one time she had watched Optum face a situation where every option carried a cost. Not helplessness. Something harder than helplessness. The recognition that whatever came next was going to require something from you that you hadn't planned to give. If the Mercer acquisition closes, she said, the asset transfers become complete transactions. Unwinding them becomes exponentially more difficult. Yes, Patricia said, and the fraudulent ownership amendments become buried inside a completed deal. That's the intent, yes. And Margaret Vescari's payments through Crestview become operational expenses inside a closed acquisition that nobody can easily reopen. Patricia's voice was very even, yes. Claire turned back to the window. Down below, the city moved through its morning, in complete indifference, people walking, cars moving. The ordinary machinery of a day that did not know or care that a woman on the 42nd floor equivalent of a near North Side apartment was watching the last protection she had been depending on begin to dissolve. She had three options. She could fight the counter-petition through the courts and hope the judge rejected Roman's interpretation of the 2014 document before 5 o'clock. That was a 40% chance on a good day, and the document examiner hadn't even begun working yet. She could accelerate the board meeting, pull it forward to today, right now, this morning, and get in front of the board before Roman's legal team had time to use the court ruling as leverage. Or she could find something that made the acquisition so legally toxic that no buyer, no investor, and no financial institution would touch it, regardless of what any court said about the TRO. She turned from the window. The Margaret Vescari payments, she said. The $11 million through Crestview. Howard, where did that money originate? Where did it come from before it became operational expense inside the acquisition vehicles? Howard was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him typing. Give me a minute. She waited. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Claire. Howard's voice had changed. It had the quality of someone who has been looking at numbers for many hours and has just found a number that is different from all the others in a way that matters. The capitalization of the acquisition vehicles, the original money that funded the structures before the Mercer deal, was finalized. Yes. A significant portion of it traces back through 3 intermediary accounts to the original trust entities from your family's 2009 capitalization. The room went completely still. Say that again, Martin said. The money Roman used to build the acquisition structure, Howard said slowly, making sure each word landed. In significant part, I'm looking at approximately 60% of the total capitalization, came from returns and reinvestments generated by the original entities your family funded in 2009. Entities where your family trust held controlling interest. Claire felt something happen in her chest that was not exactly pain, but existed in the same region. Roman had used her family's money to build the structure he was using, to cut her family out. He had taken the returns generated by her family's original investment and routed them, through layers of intermediary accounts, into the new acquisition vehicles, in a way that obscured their origin. He had then amended the ownership structure of those vehicles to marginalize the trust that had generated the capital in the first place. It was elegant, in the way that something can be elegant and monstrous at the same time. It was the financial equivalent of convincing someone to hand you the materials to build a wall and then using the wall to lock them out. Howard, she said. Her voice was completely steady, which she noted with some distant part of her mind as a strange thing to be steady about. Is this traceable? Can you document the capital trail? I've been documenting it for the last 40 minutes, he said. I have it, Patricia. I'm here. The board meeting doesn't move, Claire said. We keep it tomorrow, but we don't wait for the court ruling on the TRO. We file a separate emergency injunction this morning, not based on the ownership amendment argument, but based on fraudulent capital diversion. The argument is that the acquisition was funded, in substantial part, with capital generated from trust assets without authorization, which makes the entire structure a fraudulent vehicle, regardless of how the ownership documents read. Silence on the line. Then Patricia said, very quietly, that's a different legal theory. It doesn't depend on the 2014 document. It doesn't depend on the ownership amendments. It's a direct fraud argument based on the capital trail. It's also an argument that, if we lose it, exposes everything we've built to counter-challenge. We won't lose it, Claire said. Howard has the documentation. The trail is there. We're not constructing an argument. We're pointing at evidence that already exists. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then I need 2 hours to draft the filing. You have 90 minutes, Claire said. We need it in front of a judge before noon. She ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a moment, completely still, her hand on the table and her eyes on the window. The morning light had changed while they were talking. It was fuller now, harder, the particular quality of Chicago November daylight that contained no softness. She thought about Roman. She thought about him in March 2014, sending documents to a woman standing in a hospital parking lot worried about her father, knowing she would sign without reading, knowing the window would not stay open long. She thought about Margaret Vescari at holiday tables, watching, waiting, maintaining that specific courteous distance while routing her son's resentment into a financial architecture that would one day make her a wealthy woman on the back of assets she had never contributed a single dollar toward creating. She thought about Selena not with anger, interestingly, with something closer to tired recognition. Selena had seen a powerful man and a system she could insert herself into, and had made choices that she probably understood, at some level, would eventually land somewhere like this. Selena was not the architect. She was an instrument of a plan she had partly understood and partly been used to execute. The architect was Roman, and behind Roman, for longer than Claire had known, had been his mother. Martin came to stand beside her at the window. He didn't say anything. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder and then took it away, because Martin understood that touch meant something different during working hours than it meant during the other kinds. "Are we going to get through this?" he asked. Not afraid, Martin didn't do afraid, but serious in the particular way of someone who needs the honest version, not the version designed to maintain morale. Claire looked at the city. "Yes," she said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She picked up her phone. "But I need to make one more call first." She dialed a number she hadn't used in 3 years. It rang 4 times, and she was preparing herself for voicemail when it picked up, and a woman's voice, older and with the particular careful diction of someone who had spent decades presenting herself as impeccable, said Claire. "This is unexpected. Margaret Vescari." Claire had not planned to call her. The idea had arrived, fully formed, in the last 60 seconds, the recognition that there was one conversation that needed to happen before the board meeting, and it was not with Roman, and it was not with Selena, and it was not with any attorney. "Margaret," Claire said, "I know about Northgate. I know about Crestview. I know about the Wyoming entity Howard is still working through. I have the wire transfers, I have the capital trail, and I have a forensic accountant who has been awake for 22 hours specifically to make sure every number is documented correctly." Silence on the line, a different quality of silence from the one Roman had produced. Roman's silences were calculating. Silence was something else. It was the silence of someone who has spent a very long time believing they were invisible and has just understood in a single moment that they were not. "I'm not calling to negotiate," Claire said. "I'm calling because I think you should know, before the board meeting tomorrow, that everything is documented. And I'm calling because I want you to hear it from me directly, rather than finding out through attorneys or investigators or the eventual public record." Margaret's voice, when it came, was very controlled. Controlled in the way of someone who has maintained control over her presentation for so long that it has become involuntary, even now, even in this. "What is it you want, Claire?" Claire thought about that question. She had been asked it by Roman, by Selena, by Patricia, by Howard. Everyone wanted to know what she wanted, as though the answer would reveal something that could still be used as a bargaining chip. "I want what was mine to be recognized as mine," Claire said. "That's all I've ever wanted. And tomorrow morning in that boardroom, that is exactly what is going to happen." She ended the call. The apartment was very quiet. Martin was looking at her with the expression she had seen on her father's face all life, the expression that preceded the 2 times her father had said, without any particular drama, "I'm proud of you, Claire." She didn't have time to think about that. She picked up her pen and went back to the table and began preparing for the next morning, because the board meeting that she had spent 3 days building toward had just become something significantly larger than she had originally intended. It was no longer about the marriage. It was no longer about the acquisition. It was no longer even, in the end, about Roman. It was about a woman who had spent 30 years building something real, and a family that had spent 30 years treating that reality as something to be managed and eventually erased. And the board meeting tomorrow was the moment when the erasure ended and the real accounting began. Claire Whitmore sat at her kitchen table in the November dark of a near North Side apartment and worked through the night, and when the first light came through the window, at 5:47 in the morning she was still working, and she was ready, in a way she had never been ready for anything in her life. Not because she was fearless, but because she had been afraid for long enough that the fear had finally burned down to something clean and useful and very, very precise. The emergency injunction landed on a federal judge's desk at 11:47 in the morning. Claire knew the exact time because Patricia texted it to her while she was in the back of a car moving through downtown Chicago traffic that seemed, on this particular morning, to have a personal vendetta against urgency. Car wasn't moving fast enough. Nothing was moving fast enough. Claire sat in the back seat with her laptop open and Howard on one earbud and Gerald on the other, and 3 separate document folders spread across her knees, and she felt the particular physical sensation of a countdown that exists not in the abstract but in the body, a tightness across the chest, a dryness in the throat, the way your hands want to do something useful when there is nothing immediately useful for them to do. The judge was the Honorable Sandra Weiss, 61 years old, appointed to the Northern District of Illinois 11 years ago, known in legal circles for 2 qualities that were relevant this morning. She read fast, and she did not tolerate waste. Patricia had written the injunction, filing in 94 minutes. Claire had read every word of it in the car on the way to the courthouse and found 3 places where she would have changed the language and said nothing about any of them. Because Patricia had forgotten more about federal civil procedure than Claire would ever know, and this was not the morning to second-guess the person holding the scalpel. The filing argument was direct. The Mercer acquisition had been substantially capitalized using returns generated by trust assets without authorization, making the acquisition vehicle itself a product of fraudulent capital diversion. The relief requested was an immediate halt to any acquisition closing activity, pending a full accounting. It was, as Patricia had said the night before, a different legal theory from the TRO. It was also, Claire believed, an airtight one. Not because legal arguments were ever truly airtight, she had been around enough courtrooms to know that certainty was a feeling, not a fact, but because Howard's documentation was thorough in the way that only 22 consecutive hours of focused forensic work could produce. The capital trail was not suggested. It was not interpreted. It was laid out in a sequence that moved from point to point with the kind of clarity that is only possible when the numbers are actually there and actually say what you claim they say. The question was whether Judge Weiss would read it before 5 o'clock. Roman found out about the second filing at 12:22. Claire knew this because at 12:23 she received a call from a number she recognized as belonging to Roman's personal attorney, a man named Victor Strauss, who had been Roman's legal instrument for 15 years, and who communicated in a register that's precisely between professional courtesy and barely managed hostility. She let it go to voicemail. 20 seconds later, she received a text. My client requests an immediate call to discuss the injunction filing. This is a courtesy notice before we respond. Claire showed the text to Martin, who was sitting beside her in the car. Martin read it. Courtesy notice, he said, with the tone of someone reading a word in a language he doesn't fully trust. It means they're scared, Claire said, or it means they're stalling. Both things can be true. She did not call Victor Strauss back. At 12:58, they arrived at Patricia's office. The conference room looked different from the day before. There were more people in it, 2 additional associates from Patricia's firm, Howard, with a second monitor set up at the far end of the table, a woman named Dr. Reyes, whom Patricia had brought in specifically for forensic document examination of the 2014 signature question, and Gerald, who had been there since 7 in the morning and whose shirt sleeves were rolled up in the way that meant he had been working continuously for long enough that the formality of his clothing had gradually surrendered to the practicality of the task. Judge Weiss's clerk called at 12:40, Patricia said, without looking up from the document she was marking, as Claire walked in. Reviewing the filing now. We may have a ruling by 3. May, Claire said. May, Patricia confirmed. Doctor. Lates looked up from the 2014 document she was examining under a magnification device that looked like something between a microscope and a jeweler's loupe. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than speed. "The signature is consistent with your known exemplars," she said to Claire. "Same letter formation, same pen pressure pattern. You signed this document." Claire had been expecting that. "What about the document itself?" "That's more interesting, Doctor." Ressis set down the magnification tool. "The paper stock and ink are consistent with 2014. Nothing physically altered after the fact, no erasures, no additions, no chemical interference. But the document layout has an anomaly." Everyone in the room looked at her. "The property transfer language, the section that Roman's attorneys are using as the basis of their argument on pages 4 through 6. The signature page is page 7. She paused. "The font on pages 4 through 6 is 0.02 larger than the font on every other page of the document." Howard looked up from his monitor. "That's not a variation you'd notice reading normally, Doctor." Reyes continued. "It's only visible under magnification and direct comparison. But it's consistent with pages 4 through 6 being printed on a different day from the rest of the document, using a marginally different printer calibration, and then assembled with the original pages before the document was presented for signature." The room was very quiet. "So the signature is authentic," Claire said slowly. "But the pages she signed are the same that were in the document when it was signed." "That's my assessment, yes. The signature is genuine. The document it's currently attached to is not entirely the document that was signed." Martin put both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "That's document fraud," Howard said. It came out almost conversational, the way he said most things, but his eyes were not conversational. "It's a supplemental argument," Patricia said. "We can't lead with it today, Doctor. Reyes needs time to write the formal examination report, and we need to get it verified by a second examiner before we file it with the court. But it means that even if Judge Weiss doesn't rule in our favor on the injunction today, we have a follow-on that changes the entire shape of the 2014 document argument." "How long for a second examiner?" Claire asked. 24 hours minimum, Doctor," Reyes said. 48 to be thorough. "So we can't use it today." "No." Claire looked at the magnification device sitting on the table beside the 2014 document. She looked at those pages 4 through 6, that had been assembled into a document a woman had signed in a hospital parking lot while her father was connected to monitors inside a building 30 feet away, trusting that what was being handed to her was what she was told it was. She felt something that she had been managing for 4 days begin to move in a direction she couldn't entirely control. It was not tears. She was not going to cry in this room, not today, not with this many people present, and this many things still requiring her functional attention. It was something below tears. The physical weight of understanding a thing completely. She picked up her pen. "Then we go with what we have," she said. "The injunction, the capital trail, and Howard's documentation. We don't wait for the document examination. We go to the board meeting tomorrow with what we can prove right now, and we add the document fraud argument when Dr. Reyes has her formal report," agreed Patricia said. "What's Roman doing right now?" Martin asked. Gerald checked his phone. His attorneys filed a response to the injunction at 1:15. "They're arguing the capital trail documentation is incomplete and selectively interpreted. They've submitted their own accounting. I just received a copy." He looked at Howard. "Your counterpart has apparently been working through the night on their side, too." Howard held out his hand for the document. Gerald slid it down the table. Howard read the first 3 pages in approximately 90 seconds and said, "They've excluded the intermediary accounts. They're presenting the capital origin as external investment rather than trust returns by cutting the trail at the 3rd layer." "Can they make that argument stick?" Claire asked. "In front of a judge who reads quickly and doesn't have time to trace 4 layers of account transfers before 5 o'clock? Howard set the document down. "Possible." The room absorbed that. Claire stood up. She walked to the window. There was a window in this conference room, too, a different view than the apartment, looking east toward the lake. The water was visible from here on a clear day, but today was not a clear day. The sky had the low, compressed look of weather coming in, the clouds sitting heavy and uniform in a way that removed all sense of depth from the horizon. "What time does the board meeting start tomorrow?" she asked. 8 a.m., Patricia said. "Roman will be there." "Yes. His attorneys will try to arrive with a court ruling in hand that neutralizes our injunction argument. They'll try. Which means if Judge Weiss doesn't rule by 5 today, they'll be filing emergency motions tonight to get a ruling before 8 tomorrow morning." "That's correct." Claire turned from the window. "Then we need to be in that boardroom before 8. We need to be set up and ready before Roman walks in. Every document, every exhibit, every piece of Howard's documentation visible and organized before he sits down. I don't want Roman to walk into a meeting. I want him to walk into a room where the conclusion is already written on the wall and the only remaining question is whether he's going to acknowledge it." Martin looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Howard. Something passed between all three of them that was not quite a word, but functioned like one. "We'll be there at 6, Martin said. Judge Weiss issued her ruling at 4:17 in the afternoon. The injunction was granted. The specific language of the ruling cited the Capitol Trail documentation as sufficiently documented to establish probable cause for the fraud claim, and ordered an immediate freeze on all closing activity related to the Mercer acquisition pending a full evidentiary hearing. Patricia called Claire at 4:19. She said 3 words: "We got it." Claire was sitting in the near Northern Side apartment when the call came, alone for the first time in what felt like days, having sent Martin and Gerald to handle the board preparation, and asked for 2 hours by herself. She had told herself the 2 hours were for preparation. She knew, with the honesty you can only access when nobody else is in the room, that they were also for the things she had not allowed herself since standing in the corridor outside Roman's office 6 days ago. She sat at the kitchen table after Patricia's call and stayed very still for a long time. Then she went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her face and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly as long as it took to recognize the person looking back and decide that person was going to be all right. She went back to the kitchen table and kept working. The boardroom was on the 38th floor of a building on LaSalle Street, neutral ground in the sense that it belonged to the legitimate business board rather than to Roman personally. Claire arrived at 6:14 in the morning with Martin and Gerald and Howard and 2 of Patricia's associates, and they set up for 2 hours in the particular focused silence of people who understand that what they do in the next 2 hours will determine what happens in the next 2 hours after that. Howard arranged the documentation displays. Gerald organized the financial exhibits in the sequence Patricia had specified. Martin walked the room twice, slowly, checking sight lines and positioning in the way he had learned from their father, who had always believed that a room told you something about the people in it if you looked at it before they arrived. Claire stood at the head of the table and felt the room around her. It was a good room. Long windows on 2 sides, a table that seated 14, a presentation screen at the far end. She had been in this room before quarterly board presentations, occasional emergency sessions over the years, when something in the business network required group attention. She had almost always been the person sitting to Roman's left, the quiet presence that everyone acknowledged and nobody addressed directly, unless they needed something that fell into the category of things Roman's wife handled. She sat down at the head of the table. She had never sat at the head of this table before. It felt different from what she had expected. Not triumphant. Not the way she might have imagined it feeling on the occasions when she had allowed herself to imagine anything about this moment. It felt like sitting in a chair. It felt like the thing you do when you have somewhere to be and you sit down and you wait for the work to begin. That was fine with her. The board members arrived between 7:40 and 7:58. There were 9 of them, men and women who had been associated with the legitimate business network for varying lengths of time, who had built their connection to Roman's organization through the specific gravity, his reputation, and the financial returns that reputation had consistently delivered. They were not naive people. They were people who had chosen, over the years, to focus their questions on what the numbers showed and to ask fewer questions about the machinery underneath the numbers. This morning they were going to have to look at the machinery. Claire watched them process the room as they entered. Each of them did the same thing, a brief, involuntary stop at the door when they saw who was sitting at the head of the table and how the room was arranged. Some of them recovered faster than others. Davis, the board member who had called Roman about the meeting, walked in, saw Claire, and had a visible moment of adjustment before he made it to his seat. Roman arrived at 8:02. He walked in with Victor Strauss and another attorney Claire didn't recognize, and a third man who was carrying a document case and whose role she couldn't immediately identify. Roman was wearing a suit she recognized charcoal, his best one, the one he wore when he needed to perform certainty in front of people who were thinking about doubting him. His face was composed with the particular skill of someone who had spent decades requiring his face to be composed regardless of what was happening behind it. He saw Claire at the head of the table and stopped. Not the small stop the board members had made. A full stop. 2 seconds of absolute stillness that was, for Roman Vescari, the equivalent of anyone else's visible shock. Then he walked to his usual seat, which was now not at the head but at the side, third chair from the end, and sat down without saying anything. Victor Strauss leaned toward him and said something in a low voice. Roman nodded once without looking at him. Patricia entered behind them and took her seat beside Claire. Claire looked at the room. "Thank you all for being here," she said. Her voice came out even, which she was grateful for, because her heart was doing something irregular that she was choosing to ignore. "I'll be direct about why we're here and what we need to decide today, because I don't think anyone in this room benefits from an extended version of this conversation." She looked at Roman when she said the last sentence. He looked back. The legitimate business network that this board oversees was substantially built on capital contributed by my family trust. "Beginning in 2009, she said. "The controlling interests established by that original capitalization are documented in agreements that predate every subsequent restructuring. A series of amendments to the operating agreements of 6 entities within this network were filed without the authorization required by the original trust documents. Those amendments were designed to reclassify my family trust's controlling interest as a passive minority position in preparation for the Mercer acquisition." She paused. Nobody spoke. Additionally, the capital used to fund the acquisition vehicles was substantially sourced from returns generated by the trust assets, again, without authorization. The documentation supporting both of these findings has been prepared by an independent forensic accountant and is before you in the folders on the table. She watched the board members open the folders. She watched their eyes move. She watched the different speeds at which different people processed what they were reading, some of them going straight to the numbers, some reading the narrative summary first. One woman near the middle of the table who turned immediately to the Capitol Trail exhibit and stayed there for a long time. Roman said, "I'd like to respond." "You'll have the opportunity," Claire said. "I'd like to respond now, Roman." Her voice was very quiet. "You'll have the opportunity." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read, something that contained anger and something that contained, underneath the anger, the faintest shadow of something else. She didn't spend time on it. She turned back to the board. "The board has the authority, under the original operating agreements that were not validly amended, to suspend executive authority pending an independent investigation. I'm asking this board to exercise that authority today." Victor Strauss stood up. "I need to object to the characterization of the amendments as invalid. Our position is..." "Victor." Patricia's voice had the quality of someone who has been practicing law for 30 years and has a very specific tone reserved for opposing counsel who stand up when they haven't been invited to. "You're not a board member. You're here as counsel to one of the principals. You'll address the board when the board asks you to." Strauss looked at the board members. Several of them nodded without visible enthusiasm. He sat down. Roman's jaw was tight. "I want to speak," he said. Claire, not to the room, directly at her, the way he had always spoken to her in the early years, without the performance, without the management, just direct. "I want the board to hear my position before any vote happens." Claire considered that for a moment. She considered the room, the documentation, the 9 board members, who were still reading through folders with expressions that ranged from careful neutrality to visible concern. "The floor is yours," she said. Roman stood up. He looked different standing than he had looked walking in. Less composed. Not unraveling Roman Vescari did not unravel. It wasn't in his construction, but something in the architecture of his usual presentation had developed a crack. And through the crack, you could see something that was not the untouchable figure his reputation described. You could see a man who had been awake for most of the last 4 days, making decisions about how to protect something he was afraid of losing, and who was now standing in a room where the protection had run out of road. "I built this network," he said. "Every one of you knows that. You've sat in this room for years because of what I built. The returns you've seen, the positions you hold, the reputation this organization carries, that comes from decisions I made, risks I took, relationships I built when most of you were watching from the outside." He paused. Some of the board members were looking at him. Some were still looking at their folders. "The trust capitalization in 2009 was important," he said. "I'm not disputing that. Claire's family contributed significantly at a critical time. But the value created from that capitalization, the returns, the growth, the organization this became, that value came from execution, from leadership, and the idea that a controlling interest established by a one-time capital contribution should permanently dictate the direction of something that has grown into what this is today." He stopped. "That's not how you run a business." The room was quiet. Claire said, "Roman." He looked at her. "The question in front of this board is not whether your leadership contributed to growth," she said. "The question is whether you had the authority to alter the ownership structure of these entities without the consent required by the original agreements. Those are 2 different questions. The board isn't being asked to evaluate your leadership. They're being asked to evaluate whether the legal foundation of the acquisition is valid. The amendments were filed without authorization," she said. "That's documented. That's not an interpretation. That's a fact that your own legal team cannot dispute, because the authorization signatures don't exist." Roman looked at his attorney. Strauss gave a small, barely perceptible shake of his head. Additionally, Claire said, and she looked at the woman near the middle of the table, who had been focused on the Capitol Trail exhibit since the meeting began, "The board should be aware of something beyond the ownership amendment question." She nodded to Howard. Howard stood and connected his laptop to the presentation screen. The display behind Claire came to life with a document, a wire transfer record, clean and clear, the kind of document that does not require explanation because it is its own explanation. "Over the past 26 months, Claire said, approximately $11 million was paid from the acquisition vehicle operating accounts to 2 consulting entities, Northgate Advisory Partners and Crestview Strategic Group. These payments were categorized as general operational expenses. They were not disclosed to the board as related party transactions." She looked at Roman. "The beneficial owner of both entities," she said, "is Margaret Vescari." The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. No one stood up, no one raised their voice, no audible sound was made by anyone at the table. But the quality of the silence shifted in a way that was, in its own way, louder than sound. 3 of the board members looked at Romans simultaneously. 2 others looked at each other. Davis, the one who had called Roman the week before, looked at the wire transfer record on the screen and looked at said folder, and then put his pen down very carefully on the table in front of him. Roman stood completely still. Claire watched him. She watched him absorb it, not the information itself, because Roman had known about the payments. But the experience of watching that information become visible in this room, in front of these people, in a format that removed every layer of distance between the fact and the understanding of the fact. She watched his face go through something she had never seen it go through in 30 years. Not anger, not calculation, something that looked, for just a moment, like a man seeing something about himself that he had been successfully not seeing for a very long time. Then it closed. The composure came back, not fully but enough, and he sat down. "The board will need time to review this information," Strauss said from beside him. "The board has the information in front of them," Patricia said. The motion before the board is a suspension of executive authority pending independent investigation. The board can vote now or adjourn for 30 minutes to review the documentation. Those are the options. We're adjourning for 20 minutes, the woman near the middle of the table said. She had the particular authority of someone who has been in boardrooms long enough to understand how they actually work versus how they appear to work. And when she spoke, the other board members looked at her, the way you look at the person in the room whose judgment everyone has already decided to defer to. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and she had been on this board for 9 years. And she had always sat to the right of Roman's seat and directed her questions to him with the careful precision of someone who asks questions not because she doesn't already know the answers, but because she wants the other person to hear themselves say the answers out loud. 20 minutes, Eleanor Marsh said. We will review, and then we will vote. She looked at Claire, then she looked at Roman. And what passed between Eleanor Marsh and Roman Vescari in that look was the compressed summary of 9 years of boardroom history. Every question she had asked that he had deflected, every number she had probed that he had redirected, every moment she had watched him fill a room with presence in place of transparency, arriving now at its conclusion. The board members stood and moved toward the side room. Roman stayed seated. Everyone else filed out until it was Claire and Roman and the attorneys in the main room, and the attorneys had the professional awareness to move toward opposite ends of the table and look at their phones, and the room became, for the first time in days, something close to private. Roman looked at his hands. He looked at the presentation screen, which still showed the wire transfer document. He looked at the folder in front of him, which he had not opened. Then he looked at Claire. My mother, he said. He came out flat. Not a question, not an explanation, just 2 words. Yes, Claire said. How long have you known? 3 days. He nodded slowly. The arithmetic again, she could see it, but slower this time. Less purposeful, more like a man trying to understand a map after he's already walked off the edge of it. She told me payment were consulting fees, that she was providing strategic guidance on the acquisition structure. Did you ask what guidance? He didn't answer. Roman. She kept her voice even. Not cold. She wasn't doing cold. She wasn't performing anything in this moment. Did you ask? No, he said quietly. 1 word, and it cost him something to say it. She's been taking money from the organization for over 2 years, Claire said, through structures that were specifically designed to be invisible to the board. Whatever she told you about consulting fees, she knew exactly what she was doing. Roman looked at the screen again, at his mother's name on a wire transfer record in a federal court filing. She told me for years, he said slowly, that you were a weight, that you were holding me to your family's money and your family's name, and that I would never be fully what I could be as long as you were controlling the financial foundation. He stopped. She said it like she was trying to help me. She was trying to help herself, Claire said. She needed you to believe you had outgrown me, because once you believed that, you'd be willing to restructure things in ways that created room for her. Roman sat with that for a long time. The side room was visible through the glass partition. Board members reading, talking in low voices. Eleanor Marsh, at the center of a cluster of 3 others, her reading glasses on now, moving through Howard's documentation with methodical attention. I'm going to lose the vote, Roman said. Yes, Claire said. They're going to suspend my authority. Yes, he looked at her. The composure was still there, but thinner now. Like ice in early March, technically intact, but you wouldn't trust your weight on it. And after the investigation? That depends on what the investigation finds, she said. You know what it'll find. She didn't answer. He looked at his folder again. Then he opened it. He looked at the first page, the Capitol Trail exhibit. The same one Eleanor Marsh had been studying since the meeting began, and he read it with the expression of someone who is seeing the architecture of their own decisions laid out in a format that makes the decisions undeniable. The 20 minutes passed. The board members filed back in. Eleanor Marsh took her seat and looked at the room with the expression of someone who is the decision and has no ambiguity left about it. She looked at Claire. She looked at Roman. She looked at the other 8 board members, who had settled into their chairs with the specific stillness of people who know a vote is coming and have already decided how they're casting it. "The board is prepared to vote," Eleanor said. Claire looked at Roman one last time. He was looking at the table. The vote began. The vote took 4 minutes. 4 minutes was not a long time in any measurable sense, but inside that boardroom on the 38th floor of a building on LaSalle Street, 4 minutes had the particular density of time that only accumulates when everything that came before it is compressed into a single moment of consequence. Claire sat at the head of the table and watched each board member respond to Eleanor Marsh's call, and she did not count the votes as they came in because she did not need to count them. She could read the room the way her father had taught her to read rooms, not from the words but from the bodies, the angle of a shoulder, the way a hand rested on a folder, the specific quality of stillness that preceded a decision already made. 7-2. 7 in favor of suspending Roman Vescari's executive authority pending independent investigation. 2 opposed Davis, who had called Roman the week before, and a man named Garrett, who had been on the board for 3 years, and whose financial relationship with Roman extended beyond the legitimate network in ways that the investigation would eventually illuminate. Those 2 men voted no, with the particular expression of people who understand they are casting a losing vote and are doing it anyway, because the alternative costs them something they are not yet ready to pay. Eleanor Marsh announced the result without ceremony. Roman did not move. Victor Strauss put his hand on Roman's arm and said something close to his ear. Roman looked at the attorney's hand on his arm, the way you look at something that is touching you that you have forgotten is there. And then he looked at the vote tally that Eleanor Marsh had written in her precise handwriting on the notepad in front of her. And then he looked at Claire. She looked back. There was no triumph in it, which surprised her. She had spent 6 days working toward this moment, with everything she had. And now that it had arrived, she felt not triumphant, but something closer to exhausted and accurate, the feeling of having done the thing that needed doing, and arriving on the other side of it, to discover that the other side looks different from how you imagined it during the doing. "The suspension is effective immediately," Eleanor Marsh said to the room. "Roman, your access to executive systems and accounts will be restricted as of close of business today. An independent investigation committee will be appointed within 48 hours. Victor, your firm will receive the formal notification through standard channels." She paused and looked at him directly. "I'd encourage full cooperation from all parties." Roman stood up. He buttoned his jacket, a small automatic gesture, the kind of thing the body does when it needs to perform normality, while the mind is somewhere else entirely. He picked up the folder from the table in front of him. The folder he had opened and looked at and then closed again. He held it in one hand at his side. He looked at the board members. 7 of them looked back. Davis and Garrett were looking at the table. Then he looked at Claire one final time. She expected him to say something. Roman Vescari had always had something to say. In 30 years, she could not recall a single significant moment where he had not filled the available silence with language, with positioning, with the careful deployment of words that did the work he needed done. It was one of the things she had loved about him early on, that fluency, that ability to make a room feel like he understood something the rest of them were still working toward. He said nothing. He walked out. Strauss and the document case man followed. The door closed with the kind of quiet that is itself a statement. The board members began the procedural conversation investigation, committee composition, documentation protocols, public disclosure requirements. Patricia entered the discussion with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this conversation for 3 days. Claire sat at the head of the table and participated where her participation was required, and let the machinery of consequence move at its own pace. Somewhere in the middle of the procedural discussion, Martin came and stood behind her chair and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the way he had in the apartment kitchen. She reached up and put her hand over his for a moment. Then they both went back to work. The Mercer's acquisition was formally canceled 11 days later. The cancellation came not through court order, but through the withdrawal of the primary buyer, a private equity group that had been presented with the injunction filing and Howard's Capital Trail documentation, and had made the determination, with the speed that institutional investors make determinations when legal exposure becomes visible, that the transaction was not worth the risk it now carried. They issued a brief statement through their communications office, citing due diligence, concerns, and thanked all parties for their time. Roman's public announcement, the grand gathering he had been planning for the ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, the event he had designed to demonstrate his untouchability, was canceled 48 hours before it was scheduled to occur. The official reason given by his communications team was a scheduling conflict. Nobody who understood what had happened over the preceding 2 weeks believed the official reason, but nobody who worked in Roman Vescari's communications team was in a position to offer the real one. Claire heard about the cancellation from Gerald, who heard about it from someone at the venue who had worked with their organization before. She was in the near North Side apartment when Gerald called, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was reading through the investigation committee's initial document request, and she listened to Gerald's report and said, "All right," and went back to the document request. She did not feel relief, exactly. She felt the absence of something that had been occupying a large amount of internal space for 2 weeks, which is related to relief but not quite the same thing. Selena Cross cooperated with the independent investigation. She had called Patricia the night Claire told her to, and she had been thorough in a way that went beyond what anyone had expected, thorough enough that the investigation committee's lead counsel told Patricia in one of the early briefings that Selena Cross's account of the internal decision-making process around the ownership amendments was the single most useful piece of testimony they had received. Selena had documented everything. Not because she was a careful person by nature, she was, but that wasn't the reason, but because she had understood, somewhere in the middle of the asset transfer planning, that she was operating in a structure where, if anything went wrong, the person with the least institutional protection would bear the most institutional consequence. She had kept records the way you keep records when you know you are the most expendable person in the room. Those records turned out to be, in the accountant Howard's words when he reviewed them, a complete operational history of every decision made inside the acquisition structure for the past 26 months. The records included communications that documented Roman's direct involvement in the decision to restructure the ownership amendments. They included communications that documented his awareness of the capital trail and his instruction to route it through intermediary accounts. And they included, buried in a thread from 14 months ago, a communication between Roman and his mother that described the consulting arrangement with Crestview Strategic Group in terms that made clear Roman had understood the nature of the payments from the beginning. He had not been deceived by his mother. He had participated. When Claire read that particular thread, Patricia brought it to her in the apartment on a Thursday evening, printed on plain paper, no annotation, just the words themselves. She sat with it for a long time without speaking. Patricia sat across from her and drank her coffee and did not try to fill the silence because Patricia understood that some silences needed to run their course. He knew, Claire said eventually. Yes, he knew what she was taking, and he let it happen. The communication makes that clear. Yes. Claire put the document down on the table. She looked at it, sitting there, this piece of paper that contained, in Roman's own words to his own mother, confirmation that the betrayal had been more complete than even Claire had understood when she stood outside a glass door in a corridor 6 days into what felt like another lifetime. She had thought, in her most unguarded moments over the past weeks, that there might be some version of events in which Roman had been manipulated as much as she had. Some version where his mother and Selena had worked on him in ways he hadn't fully understood, feeding him a story he had believed because he wanted to believe it, shaping his resentment because it was easier than examining it. She had allowed herself that version because it made the 30 years slightly more bearable to contemplate. The document on the table did not allow that version. Roman had known. He had made choices. He had allowed his mother to extract money from a system built partly on Claire's family's foundation, and he had allowed that extraction to continue for over 2 years, and he had simultaneously been planning to push Claire out of the ownership structure she had helped create. He had not been a man deceived into arrogance. He had been a man who chose it, repeatedly, over a long period of time. Claire picked up the document and put it in the folder with the others. "All right," she said. "What's next?" Margaret Vescari's situation resolved itself in the particular way that situations involving hidden financial structures tend to resolve themselves once the structures become visible, quickly, quietly, and without the dignity that the person at the center of them had spent their life cultivating. The investigation committee referred the Northgate and Crestview payments to the relevant financial authorities 6 weeks after the board vote. Margaret's attorney, a man she had retained privately, separate from Roman's legal team, which said something about the degree to which she had anticipated this possibility, negotiated a settlement that required full restitution of all payments received through both entities and a dissolution of both structures, in exchange for a resolution that stopped short of criminal referral. Claire had not been asked whether she found this arrangement satisfactory. The decision belonged to the investigation committee and the relevant authorities. If she had been asked, she would have said that satisfactory was not the word she would have chosen, but that it was sufficient. That there was a difference between those two things, and she had made her peace with living in that difference. She had not spoken to Margaret Vescari since the phone call, the night before the board meeting. She did not expect to speak to her again. She found, when she examined her feelings about Margaret honestly, that what she felt was less anger than something sadder and more complicated. Margaret Vescari had spent decades feeding her son a story about the woman he married. She had spent decades maneuvering for position inside a family structure, monetizing her son's ambitions, shaping his resentments for her own purposes. And in the end, what she had accomplished was the destruction of her son's reputation, the loss of her own carefully maintained position, and the permanent alteration of her relationship with the only child she had. Claire did not think that was a life well spent, but that was Margaret's accounting to do, not hers. Roman came to see her 3 months after the board vote. He called first, which she had not expected. He called her direct number on a Tuesday morning, and she answered, and he said, "I'd like to see you." Not through attorneys, just us. And she had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "All right," because the conversation that needed to happen between them had been waiting for long enough that she was ready to have it finished. He came to the near North Side apartment, which he had not known existed before, and which she had not explained when she gave him the address. He knocked. She opened the door. He looked different. Not diminished, Roman Vescari did not diminish. It wasn't structurally possible for him, but settled, somehow, in a way he had never looked during all the years of building and expanding and projecting. Like a man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for so long that he had forgotten it was heavy and had put it down, and was now experiencing the strange lightness of its absence. He was holding an envelope and a document case. She stepped back and he came inside, and she gestured toward the kitchen table. And they sat across from each other, which was, she reflected, where most of the significant conversations of the past 2 months had happened at kitchen tables, with documents and coffee, and the particular flatness of fluorescent light that does not allow anything to look more or less than what it actually is. He put the envelope and document case on the table between them. "The envelope is the signed withdrawal of my claims on the disputed business interests," he said. "My attorney has the matching filing. Patricia will receive the court confirmation by end of week." Claire looked at the envelope. "The document case," he said, and then he stopped. He put both hands on the table, flat, and looked at them for a moment. "The document case is a written acknowledgement of your role, of your family's role, of what existed before me and what I did with it." He paused. "It's not legally binding. It doesn't change any of the proceedings or the outcomes. It's just," he paused again, and she could see him working at the words the way he had always worked at things that required him to be precise about something uncomfortable. "I wanted there to be a record that wasn't produced by investigators or court orders. Something I produced voluntarily. Claire pulled the document case toward her and opened it. The document inside was 4 pages. Handwritten on plain paper in Roman's careful angular script. She recognized his handwriting, the way you recognize everything about a person you have known for 3 decades, the specific slant of the letters, the way his capital C had always curved slightly wider than it needed to. She read the first page, the second. She read it the way she read everything completely, without skipping, without letting the difficulty of the content become a reason to stop. When she finished, she set it down. "It took me a long time to write," he said. "I started it 6 times before I could get past the second paragraph." "I can tell," she said. It was not an unkind observation. The writing showed the effort. There were places where the pressure of the pen changed, places where sentences were longer or shorter than his usual rhythm, places where you could see the point at which he had put the pen down and picked it up again. "I told myself for years that the story I was telling was the true version," he said. "That I had built something, and your family had provided early financing, and that the thing I'd built had outgrown its original financing in the way that businesses outgrow their seed capital, and that the two things were separate." He paused. "I told myself that story until I believed it, and then I found people who confirmed it, which made it easier to keep believing." Selena confirmed it. Selena. He said her name with a flatness that contained a great deal. Selena saw what I needed to hear and provided it. "I know that now. I didn't know it then, or I didn't want to know it, which is its own kind of knowing." He looked at the table. "My mother did the same thing for longer." Claire waited. "My mother." The words came out with a weight that was not anger and not grief exactly, but something's in the territory of both. "I don't know how to. I'm still trying to understand how I missed it. For that long, the payments, what she was doing." He shook his head, a small movement, almost involuntary. "She told me Claire was holding me back. She told me that from the time we were engaged. And I listened to her, because she was my mother and because it was easier than asking why she needed me to believe that. She needed you to believe it because she was positioning herself," Claire said. "She needed you to resent me enough to want to restructure things. And she needed access to those structures." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I gave her that access. I didn't ask questions about the consulting fees, because the amounts were manageable within the operational budgets, and because they were my mother, and because asking questions about my mother felt like a different category of problem from the acquisition." He stopped. "That was convenient thinking. I was good at convenient thinking." Claire did not argue with that. "The investigation committee asked me the same question. 4 different ways," he said. "Whether I knew the nature of the payments, whether I understood what she was taking, whether I authorized the arrangement." He paused. "I told them the truth. All 4 times, which cost me considerably more than lying would have, but I had apparently exhausted my available supply of productive dishonesty." Something in his voice on that last sentence was different, not quite irony, but something adjacent to it. Something that sounded like a sour man who had been forced to develop an acquaintance with a version of himself he had previously been avoiding, and who was still deciding what to do with that acquaintance. Claire looked at the handwritten document on the table between them. "This doesn't fix anything," she said, not unkindly. "No, it doesn't change what happened. No, and it doesn't change where we are." "I know." He looked at her directly. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Claire. I'm not here to argue for something I want. I gave up the right to ask you for things." He paused. "I'm here because there's a record now. Court records, investigation records, deposition transcripts, financial documentation. And all of that is accurate, as far as it goes. But it describes the mechanics. It doesn't describe the..." He stopped. "It doesn't say what you did, what you built, what your family contributed, and what you personally made possible. And I wanted there to be something, somewhere, in my handwriting, that said it correctly." Claire sat with that for a long moment. Outside the apartment window, Chicago was moving through a Tuesday in February gray sky, the particular cold that came off the lake in that month, the sound of the city doing what it always did. She had sat at this table through November and December and January, working through the investigation documentation, and the business restructuring, and the legal proceedings. and she had watched the city outside this window through all of those months with the specific relationship you develop with a view when you spend significant time looking at it, not familiarity, exactly, but a kind of companionship. She looked at Roman across the table. He looked back, and he looked like what he was, a 62-year-old man who had built something significant and lost something more significant, sitting in a kitchen he didn't own. Waiting for a judgment from a woman, he'd forfeited the right to influence. "I forgive you," she said. He blinked. Once. The smallest possible movement, but on Roman Vescari's face it carried the weight of something considerably larger. "I'm not saying it for you," she said. "I'm saying it because carrying 30 years of unresolved anger is not something I'm willing to do with whatever time I have. I've been angry. I've been angry enough. And long enough that the anger has done what anger does when it runs its course. It's become something I'm finished with." She paused. "But I want to be clear about what forgiving you means and what it doesn't mean." He waited. "It means I'm not going to spend the rest of my life organizing my choices around what you did," she said. "It means the weight of this ends here, in this kitchen, with whatever this conversation is. It does not mean what happened is acceptable. It does not mean I trust you. And it does not mean that I am coming back to anything we had." "I know," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Do you?" "Yes." He paused. "I knew before I came here. I know what I lost. I know I lost it through decisions I made, over years, that were available to me and that I chose." He stopped. Started differently. "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing everything they built. I understand now that the worst thing is understanding exactly how you lost it. The why of it. Because the why of it turns out to be you." The kitchen was very still. Claire picked up the handwritten document and put it carefully back in the case. Put the case to one side. She picked up the envelope with the withdrawal filing and placed it on top of the folder where the rest of the legal documents lived. "Go live somewhere different," she said, not harshly. "The way you say something that is true and needs to be said directly, without cruelty. Don't stay in Chicago trying to rebuild the same thing. Build something else. Be honest about why you're starting over and what you're starting over from. That's the only way any of this means anything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He stood up. He straightened his jacket, the same small automatic gesture, the body doing what it always does. He picked up the document case, Claire. At the door, his hand on the frame. She had a sudden disorienting memory of standing in a corridor outside, a glass door 6 weeks before all of this began, watching him through a gap in a door he had not fully closed. The geometry of this moment was almost identical. The door, his hand, the frame, the space between them. "I did love you. I want you to know that, whatever else is true, and a great deal of other things are true, that one was real." She looked at him. "I know," she said, for a while. He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. She sat there until the particular stillness of an empty apartment became something she recognized as simply quiet rather than absence. And then she stood up and washed the 2 coffee cups she had put out. She had put out 2 cups automatically, without thinking, and put them away, and opened her laptop and went back to work. The restructuring of the legitimate business network took 8 months. Claire worked with the board Eleanor Marsh primarily, who turned out to be the kind of ally who was useful precisely because she was not warm in the easy sense, but was thorough and direct, and never confused sentiment with strategy to bring in professional leadership, clean the financial architecture down to its actual foundations, and remove every connection to Roman's organization that could not be justified on its own merits. It was painstaking work. It was sometimes boring work. It required attending to details that were unglamorous and essential, kind of details that had always been Claire's particular talent, and that Roman had always described as her thoroughness, in a way that was simultaneously a compliment and a marginalization, as though thoroughness were a trait suited to the background work, not the front. She did not do it in the background. She was at the table for every significant decision. She asked the questions she had always known to ask, the ones she had learned from her father, the ones that went to the foundation rather than the surface. And she discovered, over 8 months of this, that the women and men she was working with were not surprised by her competence. They had simply not been given a context in which to see it before. Gerald told her once, in the middle of a particularly complicated restructuring session, that he had been waiting for her to run something for the better part of 2 decades. She told him that was a long time to wait. He said he had been patient. She told him patience was the wrong word for it, and he laughed, which was one of the few times she had heard Gerald laugh in 22 years. Selina Cross left Chicago. The investigation committee's findings regarding Selina's role in the ownership amendments were complicated. The documentation established her as the executor of decisions that had originated with Roman, and her cooperation had been sufficiently complete that the formal outcome landed in a territory that was professionally damaging, but not legally catastrophic. She lost her position, her reputation within the financial advisory community in Chicago, and the network she had spent a decade building inside Roman's organization. She moved to another city. Claire did not know which one and did not ask. She had thought, in the early weeks after the board vote, that she would feel something specific about Selina anger, or contempt, or the particular hurt that comes from being displaced by another person in the attention of someone you love. She had been surprised to find that what she mostly felt was something like clarity. Selina had been a person who had seen a structure she could enter and had entered it. She had made choices inside that structure that had consequences. She had cooperated when cooperation was the only remaining option. What she had taken from Claire was Roman's fidelity, and Roman's fidelity had, by the time Selina entered the picture, already been receding for reasons that were entirely Roman's. Selina had not built the conditions that made any of it possible. Roman had built them year by year, choice by choice, and Margaret Vescari had been telling him what to build for longer than any of them had understood. 1 year after the board vote, on a Tuesday morning in November, a new plaque was installed on the exterior wall of the building on LaSalle Street. Restructured Company's headquarters now occupied 4 floors. The plaque was smaller than Claire had expected when they showed her the mock-up. She had asked for it to be smaller than the original design, which had been large and formal in the way that institutional plaques tended to be. The smaller version was quiet engraved lettering on brushed steel, the Whitmore family, name and the founding date, and nothing else. No decorative elements, no description of the family's contributions. Just the name and the date, which was enough, because anyone who needed to know what those things signified would know, and anyone who didn't need to know didn't need to know. The installation happened in the morning, before the building's business hours, before the street filled with its usual Tuesday volume. Claire was there with Martin and Gerald and Eleanor Marsh, who had made time in her schedule and arrived precisely on time, and stood with her hands in her coat pockets in the November cold and watched the installation workers finish, and then stood back and looked at the plaque with the expression of someone confirming that a thing has been done correctly. Good, Eleanor said. It was her complete response to the completed installation. A reporter from a business publication was there. Patricia had arranged the access, and the reporter was young and earnest and had done her research in a way that showed. She asked Claire several questions that were thoughtful and received answers that were direct without being more than the situation required. At the end of the brief interview, the reporter asked whether Claire felt like she had reclaimed something she had lost her position, her identity, the recognition she should have had throughout. Claire looked at the building, at the plaque, at the name in brushed steel in the November light. She thought about the corridor outside a glass door and a dinner she had brought to a man who no longer wanted what she was offering, and a phone call at 11:17 at night to a man named Gerald's who was not surprised by calls at any hour. She thought about a kitchen table in a near North Side apartment that had become, without her planning it, the place where she had done the most important work of her life. She thought about her father in a hospital bed in Milwaukee and a document she had signed in a parking lot while the monitors beeped inside a building 30 feet away. She thought about Roman's face when the vote result was read, and his handwriting on 4 pages of plain paper, and the specific sound a door makes when a person closes it carefully behind them for the last time. She looked at the reporter. I didn't reclaim anything, she said. Reclaiming implies going back to something that existed before. I'm not back anywhere. She paused. I built something that belongs to me now. That's different. The reporter wrote that down. Martin was standing beside Claire when the interview ended. The four of them, Claire, Martin, Gerald, Elisor, stood on the sidewalk in front of the building for a moment, in the particular way that people stand together after something significant has been completed. When there is no immediate next task requiring attention, and the body hasn't quite received the instruction to resume normal operations. Martin said, Dad would have had something to say right now. He would have said 3 sentences, Claire said, very quietly, and then he would have gone for coffee. He always went for coffee after a thing was finished. He said it gave the thing room to be finished, instead of immediately becoming the next thing. Martin looked at the plaque. He wasn't wrong about that. Eleanor Marsh made a sound of mild agreement and looked at her watch. I have an 8:30, Claire. She turned and looked at her directly, which was how Eleanor Marsh did everything directly, without softening, without unnecessary preface. You did this well. She walked away before Claire had to formulate a response, which was also how Eleanor Marsh did most things. Gerald watched her go and said, I like that woman. She's terrifying, Claire said. That's what I mean, he said. The company held its first full board meeting under the new structure 3 weeks later in the same boardroom on the 38th floor of the same building where the vote had happened. Same table, same chairs, same windows. Claire sat at the head of it again. This time, the feeling was different. Not the absence of triumph that she had expected. This was something quieter and more durable than anything she had imagined feeling in the months when she was still working toward this moment. It was the feeling of being correctly located, of occupying a space that corresponded to something real rather than something performed or allowed or managed. She opened the meeting without ceremony, the way her father had always by stating directly what needed to be done and then doing it. Afterward, in the elevator going down, Eleanor Marsh stood beside her in the particular companionable silence that had developed between them over 8 months of working together, and said, without looking at her, You know the company needed this 20 years ago. I wasn't ready 20 years ago, Claire said. Eleanor looked at her. No, she said, but the company was. The elevator doors opened. They walked out into a Tuesday morning in late November, the city moving around them with complete indifference to what had just occurred on the 38th floor. And Claire Whitmore walked through the lobby doors onto the sidewalk and turned her face toward the wind coming off the lake and breathed in the cold and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of arrival, the specific luxury of a person who has finished carrying something that needed to be carried and has put it down and is now simply standing in November with the wind in her face and the rest of the day still ahead. She had walked away from a mafia boss's empire. She had walked away and discovered that the empire had been partly hers all along. She had taken back what was hers. And then she had done something Roman Vescari had never understood how to do. Even at the height of his power, she had built something that did not require anyone else's permission to exist. She had built a life where disappearing was no longer available to her as an option, not because she had been forced into visibility, but because she had chosen it the way you choose something you have been waiting to choose for a very long time. And the choosing turns out to feel less like a decision and more like a return to something that was always true and simply needed the right conditions to become undeniable. The wind off the lake was very cold. She pulled her coat tighter and walked.